Welcome back, gang. This is part 2 of your lecture series for Chapter 19 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled America and the Great War. The focus question for this section is, how did the United States get involved in World War I? In 1914, Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, which set into motion a chain of events that ultimately led to World War I. Of course, that's a drastic oversimplification of things, but in the interest of time, that would have to do for our purposes. Now, as war engulfed Europe, Americans were sharply divided between support for Great Britain and its allies, or Germany and its allies. Remember, in the 19th century, there were significant numbers of German immigrants into the United States. So by the early 20th century, there was significant sympathy among many of the in the American population, particularly those of German descent, for Germany and its cause in this war. Now, of course, there were significant numbers of Americans who were totally against American involvement in the war altogether. And one of those Americans was President Woodrow Wilson. He very much did not want to see the United States get involved in a costly and deadly war on the European continent, and he proclaimed American neutrality in 1914. Of course, those claims of neutrality were undercut by the fact that the United States was supplying arms and supplies to Britain and its allies. Britain was one of the most significant trading partners with the United States prior to World War I, and the United States continued that relationship at the outset of the war, something that did not sit well with Germany at the time. In May of 1915, the British ship the Lusitania was sunk by German U-boats. Now, technically, this ship was a passenger ship, and over 100 American passengers were killed in this attack. But also, this ship was carrying arms shipments from the United States to Great Britain, which is why it was targeted by the German U-boats. Of course, the fact that this ship was also carrying arms was not something that was advertised to the American public. All the American public was informed about was the fact that this ship was attacked and over 100 Americans were killed in the attack. Of course, this outraged the American public, and there began to be new calls for further action against Germany. And Wilson responded by embarking on a policy known as preparedness, which was basically a crash program to expand the American Army and Navy at an incredibly rapid pace. Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 with the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," highlighting his policy of neutrality during his first term of office. And although the election proved to be rather close, this strategy ultimately proved successful, securing Wilson's second term in office in 1916. However, in early 1917, Germany resumed submarine warfare, sinking several American vessels, which of course greatly outraged the American citizenry. Then came the Zimmermann telegram. In early 1917, German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann sent a telegram to the Mexican government that basically promised that Mexico could regain many of its lost territories that it had let go to the United States at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War in the 19th century if they entered the war as Germany's allies, and they even encouraged the Mexican government to invade the United States from its southern border. This telegram was intercepted by British intelligence agents who turned it over to the Americans. And once this telegram was made public, that was more or less the straw that broke the camel's back. And American outrage exploded, essentially forcing Wilson to ask Congress to declare war on Germany. And Wilson did so, and called for a world war to make the world safe for democracy, that the American entrance into the war was an effort to not only end Germany's aggression, but to spread American democratic institutions and ideals around the world. Wilson articulated a very idealistic plan for a new world order that was designed to provide peace and stability and make the world safe for democracy. He called this plan his 14 points, and it included provisions for the advocation for self-determination of all peoples, creation of a general association of nations, what would become the League of Nations, which was, of course, the forerunner of today's United Nations. It articulated plans for free trade and open diplomacy between all nations of the world, and it established the agenda for the peace conference that followed the war. Now, despite America having declared war in early 1917, it was still quite a long road for America to mobilize the manpower and resources it needed to actually physically enter the war. And it did not do so until the spring of 1918. And by that time, the country of Russia had faced its own internal revolution, a communist revolution. And in 1918, under its new leader, Vladimir Lenin, Russia withdrew from the war as it descended into its own civil war. Now, this pretty much closed off that Eastern Front and allowed Germany to focus all of its resources on the Western Front, which at that time was along the French border. And that is where the United States threw the majority of its manpower to focus on that front there. And the United States threw tremendous amounts of manpower and economic resources into the war, ultimately turning the tide of battle, securing victory for America, Great Britain, and their allies. Ultimately, more than 100,000 Americans died in World War I. But that was only about 1% of the 10 million soldiers killed overall, not to mention the untold millions of civilians that were killed in this very devastating war. World War I was by far the most destructive and deadly war in human history up to that point. That concludes part 2 of our Chapter 19 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.